Good morning, everyone, from an increasingly warm Washington, D.C. Welcome to today's Thursday Talk. Our Thursday Talks aim to bring you the best and most innovative learning there is in the peacebuilding field and beyond. Whether this is your first Thursday Talk or you're one of our regular participants, it's great to have you with us today. My name is Jennifer Howell, and I am the Communications and Learning Officer at Search for Common Ground and the Communications Lead over at DME for Peace, and I will be moderating today's session. So today our discussion is focusing on the topic Future Trends in Global Peace and taking a deep dive into the newly published 15th annual edition of the Global Peace Index, or GPI, as you might hear it referred to. This report, the GPI report, is the flagship publication of the Institute of Economics and Peace. And today our discussion will be led by Michael Collins, the Executive Director Americas at the Institute for Economics and Peace. And just a note about how we will all spend our time together. As our host is presenting, you can write your question using the question function in your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the Q&A portion. When you do that, you can also include your name and affiliation if you're able, so we can attribute the question back to you. And so with that, let me thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Michael, and I will hand it over to you now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And I'm going to jump straight in because there's a lot to share. I would like to speak very briefly about the Institute for Economics and Peace. We're a non-profit, non-partisan research institute. We're dedicated to shifting the world's focus to peace as a positive, tangible and achievable measure of human well-being and progress. And we do that primarily through quantitative research into peace. We kind of sort of believe very strongly that in order to know something, in order to understand it or try and understand it better, first of all, you need to start from sort of a clear definition. And then secondly, you need to be able to measure it, not only at any sort of given point in time, but also trends over time to be able to establish, what the momentums are, right, for example. So, I mean, peace is sort of a really critical issue. In fact, we could sort of almost say that it's sort of a prerequisite for meeting many of the global challenges that are going to be ahead. So we're essentially sort of set up with the aim of studying peace in a quantitative way. Thankfully, that research is used extensively by multilateral organizations around the world, as well as universities. We've got a very strong social media presence as well. And, I confess this is somewhat of a promotional slide, but the reason I like bringing it up is because it really kind of sort of speaks to the appetite that there is for looking at peace in a quantitative way and understanding more about it. And I think this is really kind of sort of a testament to the vital role that DME for Peace plays in this regard as well. So, thanks to that reception, we've been able to open up a number of offices around the world. So hopefully, if you're interested in the report or speaking with IEP, there should be an office in your time zone. So Jennifer mentioned very briefly, we've been doing the Global Peace Index for about 15 years now. What it does is it ranks 163 countries around the world according to their relative state of peacefulness. So the definition that we use here, defining peace is something that's tremendously complex. We choose to start at the bottom and potentially with definitions that are kind of sort of the most widely accepted. In this case, the lack of violence or fear of violence as a starting point. And we say that relative because, there's no country that's completely peaceful around the world. This is purely a comparison between different countries. Now, there's kind of sort of pros and cons, right? Some of the cons include things like, well, if you're trying to sort of track data points in many different countries around the world, you can only really rely on data points that are present in the country with the lowest data availability, right? So the lowest common denominator in many ways. And what that does mean is that you sort of tend to sort of potentially miss out on some of the granularity that you could have by accessing some of these more specific data sets. But one of the real pros is that you can sort of really look at peace from a sort of a level playing field, right? You can really sort of compare peacefulness globally. Through different countries, providing that you pay very close attention to the metrics and the indicators and the sources that you use, and they follow both the definition and also provide you a measure of trends as well. So we use 23 different indicators for those purposes. We use a methodology that we've developed ourselves, but it's overseen by an international panel of experts. Those 23 indicators there are sort of grouped into 3 domains. The first one is related to domestic and international conflict. The second one is more the internal dynamics of a country. And the third one relates to measures of militarization within a country. And this kind of sort of really provides us with somewhat of a multi-dimensional, I suppose you could say, assessment of levels of peacefulness. So in terms of key findings of the report this year, this is a mud map that any one of you can access on our website. It's actually interactive in nature, so you can click on any individual country, you can see its score, you can see its trends in various indicators over time. This could perhaps be most useful for those of you working in development, potentially those of you writing reports or writing proposals, for example, having some quick data to access there. Overall, we see that levels of peacefulness have deteriorated by 0.07% this year. This is the 9th deterioration in the last 13 years. 87 countries became more peaceful, 73 countries deteriorated. And this is kind of sort of something that we see each year, right? Despite more countries becoming more peaceful, we see that overall peacefulness has deteriorated. Deteriorations in peace are significantly larger than improvements in peace. To put it kind of sort of more philosophically, it's a lot more difficult to build peace than it is to destroy it. Improvements were driven in changes by ongoing conflict, internal conflict, and the impact of terrorism. Deteriorations are primarily driven in the domain of militarization, and specifically in the military expenditure domain, as well as the safety and security domain, particularly with regards to civil unrest. So we're going to be unpacking this a bit more. We see the number of violent demonstrations has significantly increased around the globe. Political instability in parallel and because of that has increased also, and I mentioned this increase in levels of militarization. 97 countries deteriorated in militarization, in other words, became more militarized, and over 100 countries actually increased their military expenditure over that time. General improvements, so we've seen a reduction in deaths from internal conflict. We've seen a reduction in the number and intensity of internal conflicts, as well as a reduction in the impact from terrorism. In fact, it's the 6th consecutive year of improvements. Iceland is the most peaceful country in the world on the 2021, and Ukraine and Iraq had the largest improvements, although it should be noted that that can be independent from their actual score. For example, in the case of Iraq, it's one of the least peaceful countries on earth, but nonetheless has improved significantly this past year. The MENA region has had the largest regional improvement, but it does remain the least peaceful region in the world out of the 9 regions that we form. Europe remains the most peaceful region. There has been a deterioration in political instability, an ongoing increase in civil unrest, but there have been improvements in the impact of terrorism. And terrorism is something that actually we track over a 5-year period. So after a terrorism attack, for example, the impact of that is quantified in an ever-reducing way over a 5-year period to take into account essentially both the economic, political, and emotional impact that terrorist attacks have. Afghanistan remains the world's least peaceful nation. But it did record a small increase in peacefulness. We'll see, obviously, what happens this year. Burkina Faso and Belarus recorded the larger deteriorations. In Burkina Faso, there's, of course, the ongoing Islamist insurgency, but there's also the arming of the militias. In Belarus, a lot of protests related to the 2020 election. North America had the largest regional deteriorations, increase in violent demonstrations. Now, you know, practically all of the Black Lives Matter movement demonstrations, for example, were peaceful in nature, but simply taking into account the amount of demonstrations that there were invariably some of those that were violent in nature, and of course, violence arising from before, during, and after the election period, in particular, the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. 6 of the 9 GPI regions recorded deteriorations, and these are the 10 most peaceful countries. Iceland remains on top, New Zealand goes up 1. Canada, on the bottom side here, you actually see deteriorated 3 places, but it actually had an improvement in peacefulness. And that happens often at the top, at the ranking. It was simply outstripped by larger improvements in peacefulness in other countries. And Singapore suffered because of that as well. It used to be in the top 10 and it is no longer, it's currently number 11. The 10 least peaceful countries, Afghanistan has been the least peaceful country for 3 years. Yemen is the least peaceful country in the MENA in the MENA region, and we tend to see broadly that more authoritarian countries are generally on the bottom side of the index, whereas more democratic countries are on the top side of the index. If we look into the impact of COVID on peacefulness, I mean, it has significantly had an impact on peacefulness that has been both positive and negative. So we see that sort of levels of violence fell at the early stages of the pandemic. Things like homicide, for example, reduced significantly early on, in some cases as much as 50%. But we're seeing that most of these sort of forms of violence are returning as and when countries are opening up. Civil unrest has increased significantly because of COVID. So there were over 15,000 civil, violent demonstrations, riots, or strikes in 2020 around the world. About 1/3 of them were exclusively related to COVID. Overall, there was a 10% increase in violent demonstrations in 2020. Political instability has deteriorated. Of course, COVID has definitely exacerbated a lot of that. And the long-term impact on the pandemic is kind of sort of unclear at this point, simply because of the fact that a lot of data is still coming in, and a lot of it will come down to sort of what is the underlying economic impact of the pandemic. If we look at the overall sort of COVID-19 related incidents around the world, and this is from January 2020 to April 2021, you can see them here, over 5,000 of them, with significant strife essentially around the world. And I'm kind of sort of hazarding a guess here. This is kind of anecdotal, and it's sort of me looking at the map right now. But I mean, it does, with some exceptions, perhaps Chile, for example, there does seem sort of a correlation between the number of cases and, of course, the number of incidents. That's kind of sort of my gut feeling here, but we haven't done that analysis. So I mentioned before, we think that economic recovery will be sort of a key factor as to whether civil unrest continues to grow, but we have seen an increasing civil unrest for the past 5 to 8 years now. So, if you take COVID-19 out of the equation, based on the trends that we've seen, we do see civil unrest continuing for the foreseeable future, at least for the next year. So, and especially, of course, accelerated by COVID. Overall, we see the countries with high levels of positive peace are best placed to recover quicker from the pandemic. So positive peace is a peace-building term that we've somewhat co-opted to describe some of the research that we do around the socioeconomic indicators or socioeconomic elements that create and sustain peacefulness. And we try and do this in a quantitative way. What we do is we take results from the Global Peace Index, and then we compare that with thousands of socioeconomic and political and cultural or attitudinal data sets to be able to see what are kind of sort of the lead changes or lead indicators that then lead to subsequent improvements or deteriorations in peacefulness. So it includes things like access to education, healthcare, access to information, particular strengths of government, governance, elements of equality, and all of those things kind of sort of combine to create and sustain peace. Now, we've used this research to develop a positive peace index, which functions in parallel to the Global Peace Index, that tracks these underlying attitudes, institutions, and structures that we see create, sustain peaceful societies. Once again, this is all done through statistical analysis. There's really kind of sort of no moral or ethical judgment at play. If you look at sort of a couple of benefits of positive peace, for example, is if you look at OECD countries, countries with high levels of positive peace were significantly less impacted in terms of unemployment than countries with lower levels of positive peace. Countries like Czech Republic, Estonia, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, countries that you see here, Lithuania, are some of the best placed for post-COVID recovery, because not only do they have high levels of positive peace, but they also have low levels of debt as well. So if we look at trends in peace, both past and future, we see that peacefulness has declined over the last 10, 12 years. Similar to before, we see how a high number of countries have become more peaceful than have actually deteriorated, but those deteriorations are more significant. This graph that you see here, that's red and green, although it's not an exact fit to these numbers that you see, is kind of sort of representative of these larger deteriorations in peacefulness that we see. This is simply a graph demonstrating this progressive deterioration in peacefulness that we've seen over the last 13 years. And we also continue to see this rising inequality in global peace. So this is a measure of peacefulness for the bottom 25 countries on the Global Peace Index and the top 25 countries on the Global Peace Index, and you see that the most peaceful countries have progressively become more peaceful, whereas the least peaceful countries have continued to deteriorate. Many of these countries are caught in the classical violence trap, or in a vicious circle. We look at kind of sort of break down these trends into the different domains. We see the significant increase in violent demonstrations. If you look into this in a more granular fashion, you actually kind of sort of see that this curve is slightly more flatter than you see it here. We've seen this significant increase in the number of displaced people around the world, which I'm sure you're very familiar with already. And perhaps counterintuitively, we've seen an ongoing deterioration in the homicide rate around the world. I have a couple of thoughts on this, but they'd be purely anecdotal in nature. In terms of the number of battle deaths and key indicators related to ongoing conflict, this large spike that you see here in the middle here is related to the war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. As you can see, battle deaths have increased since 2007, but have decreased significantly since then. The total number of conflicts around the world as a trend has increased. So we're seeing less large conflicts, such as the war in Iraq and Syria, but we are seeing smaller regional conflicts sprout up around the world. And in a similar way, the intensity of those conflicts has increased also. If we look at trends in militarization, they're kind of sort of run parallel to each other. We've seen a significant deterioration, a significant improvement as a trend in militarization over the last 10, 12 years, but we've seen that shift significantly over the last couple of years as well, due in part to rising geopolitical tensions. Looking very quickly at the economic value of peace, and let me just quickly do a time check here. Okay. We see that it's hitting pretty much the 15 trillion mark. Currently, it's a very large number. So the way that we like to describe it is essentially more than 10% of the world's GDP is either a direct impact of violence or goes to containing violence. That's nearly $2,000 per person in the world. If we were able to sort of reduce that by 10%, then that's, you know, an extra $1.5 trillion that could be directed to other economic activities. That's the same size as kind of sort of 3 moderate economies added to the world. It's also the equivalent of all foreign investment worldwide in 2020. And just to put that in further perspective, especially for sort of the development audience, a 1% decrease in violence around the world would be equivalent to all overseas development aid combined in 2020. So a lot that can be done by reducing violence. We did some analysis, or some preliminary analysis this year in partnership with Lloyd's Register. They've issued a world risk poll, which looks at risk around the world, and we've done a small analysis of the subset of some of those questions that were conducted by Gallup. Overall, for example, that we see that 1 in 7 people determine violent crime, homicide, and terrorism to be the highest risk to their safety. That does significantly change around the world. For example, 50% of people in Afghanistan, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic report violence as the greatest risk to safety in their daily lives. Overall, 20% of respondents around the world, this is 150,000 people in nearly 145 countries, report either having experienced violence themselves or knowing somebody who's experienced violence in the last 2 years. The fear of violence is amazingly high. 60% of people around the globe are worried about sustaining serious harm from violent crime. It should be noted that that is an average. When we look at it at a country level, those levels are significantly changed, both in terms of experience of violence, fear of violence, and nominating kind of sort of violent crime, terrorism, and homicide as sort of their highest risks. We'll delve into this in the next couple of slides. The overall feeling of safety around the world has increased. 75% of people feel as safe or more safe than they did 5 years ago. And the overall difference in a number of these factors between male and female, for example, 5% more women fear violence than men globally, despite the fact that actually men report experiencing violence roughly around 5% more than women. So here's a quick kind of sort of map of the proportion of people who cite crime, violence, and terrorism as their greatest threat to safety. As you can see, this is something that is significantly higher in the South American region, which saw the second deterioration largest deterioration in peacefulness this year. This is a breakdown of essentially the question related to what is the greatest risk to your safety. As you can see, crime, violence, and terrorism risks very high, just behind road-related accidents. Feelings of safety, I mentioned briefly before, have improved significantly over time with 75%, or in other words, only 25% of people feel that the world is less safe now than it was in 2014. If you want to look at kind of sort of a bit of a breakout of the different countries, these are just the tops and bottoms. As you can see, both in terms of experience of violence and fear of violence, the percentages change significantly depending on the country that you're in as well. An interesting case of Poland, for example, Poland records the least experience of violence in the whole of the European Union, in the whole of Europe, which I thought was very interesting. So you can see extremely high numbers in terms of experiencing violence in Namibia and fear of violence in Brazil, for example. Now, we do see, perhaps obviously, or thankfully, I suppose you could say, a correlation between these two things generally, right? When we look at it globally, correlation between experience of violence and fear of violence. If you look at the feelings of safety, in other words, who is feeling less safe than 5 years ago, you also see a significant sort of difference. Look at the top 5 and the bottom 5 here. And if you ask the question about what is your greatest risk, the answers vary greatly too. So if we kind of sort of break this down per region very quickly, what we see is that South America ranks very highly on most of these. Generally, you know, a region with high levels of violence, you know, ranks top or bottom, depending on how you want to look at it in terms of fear of violence. Not necessarily in terms of experience of violence, although it does have very high elements related to experience of violence. In this case, the largest is in sub-Saharan Africa. But as violence is the greatest risk or perceived risk, it is also in the highest countries. So, you know, violence a key consideration for everybody living in South America. In terms of sort of predicting changes in peacefulness and kind of sort of looking at trends in a more forward-looking manner, and perhaps as kind of sort of a conclusion to the presentation, we see that the gap between positive peace and negative peace is actually a very strong predictor of future changes in peacefulness. So we operate on what we call a sort of a positive peace deficit or surplus model. You can have a country that has relatively high levels of peacefulness in the global peace index, but really lacks some of the underlying attitudes, institutions, and structures that we find create sustain peace, that we found quantitatively to create and sustain peace. So when you do see a significant deficit in those things, you can expect a deterioration in peacefulness in the years to come. It should be said, though, that it kind of sort of usually does need some form of shock to kind of sort of unsettle that current level of peace. So COVID-19 is a perfect example of that, right? For example, how countries who may have had may have been doing okay in terms of superficial peacefulness, what we call negative peace, what you see in the global peace index, the COVID-19 pandemic comes along and really kind of sort of rattles the country in a number of ways. Of the 10 countries with the largest deteriorations in peacefulness, 7 of those had very large positive peace deficits in 2009. So once again, speaking to some of kind of sort of the predictive ability of this, which as a sort of monitoring and evaluation audience, I hope you appreciate. You know, if you kind of expand that deficit, your predictiveness actually increases significantly. For example, 90% of countries with positive peace deficits of more than 50 places instead of 20 recorded deteriorations by 2019. These are some of the countries that have had the largest positive peace deficits in 2020. And if we look at sort of the, you know, looking beyond the COVID-19 pandemic and sort of more peacefulness in the years to come, we also see other countries have been deteriorating in peacefulness, positive peace as a trend. And they're important to note because positive peace is something that deteriorates slowly. So you actually have quite a wide window to be able to kind of sort of see things coming. So countries like Eritrea, Equatorial Guinea is noted here as well, Zambia, Guinea-Bissau, Bangladesh, Qatar, and Rwanda, for example, are other examples of these countries. So that concludes the presentation. Really look forward to your questions. If you'd like to learn more about the report, you can visit our web pages. We also have a Positive Peace Academy to learn more about that particular research. And of course, you can follow the work of the Institute in all of the usual places.
Thanks so much, Michael. And I will share links in the chat during the Q&A portion. So now moving on to the Q&A portion of our discussion, a couple of notes about our format. Again, those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday Talks, you can submit a question or comment in two ways. The first is through the question function. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, which will allow us to unmute your microphone so that you can ask your questions live. And when you submit your question for us, we ask that if you feel comfortable to submit your name and affiliation. And just to note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace so that those who are not with us today can join us and go back and listen to the recording and presentation at a later time and join the discussion. So we do have a few questions that have rolled in already, Michael, besides multiple people who have written in saying that they really enjoyed your presentation and they want to get in touch and learn more. So that hopefully that is a nice bonus, good feeling for you. So I'm going to start off with a clarification question. So we have a question asking, why is the GPI focused on ranking 163 countries and not 195? That's from Abu Bakar, excuse me, Abu Bakar. And yeah, if you could just clarify that for us, that'd be great.
Sure, absolutely. So there's a couple of elements. One is that in some countries there is no available data. And then number two, in some countries, especially very small countries with a very small population and say a very low geographical kind of sort of breadth, that tends to skew the results because it is physically impossible to be able to compare what would happen in one of the smaller countries with what would happen in the larger countries. For example, if you, let's say you have a population of less than 100,000 as a country, or less than 1 million people as a country, and you have you know, a homicide rate of 2 or something like that, that really wouldn't, that same homicide rate really wouldn't transfer to a larger audience. In any pocket of people, there are bound to be some bad apples, for lack of a better word. So at some point, the differences between larger countries and smaller countries become so large that you can't compare them on a global basis. So in order to kind of sort of maintain the integrity of the research, we choose to focus on these countries. It should be said, though, that these 163 countries do cover 99.7% of the world's population.
Great, thank you for that. I actually wrote down a question, and then Leslie Solis sent in another question that really connects with it and kind of is getting to the same point. My question for you, Michael, was what would you like practitioners and organizations on the ground to take away from this GPI report in regards to how they approach their work, et cetera? Yeah, so what would you like people on the ground to take away from the findings in your report? And also Leslie Solis asks, which is somewhat of the same direction of questions, is besides providing very useful information, what are your objectives and goals with this index? What change do you seek to achieve?
Well, that's great, and if it's okay with you, I'll kind of sort of start by answering the second question. I mean, in terms of,
Sure.
of what we want to achieve, certainly is you know, overall providing a deeper understanding, you know, not only in terms of how we're doing in peace, but more importantly, you know, what are the elements that are creating and sustaining peace. You know, the Institute was kind of sort of created on on the premise that at the time, the founder of the organization wanted to find out which were the most peaceful countries on Earth and could not find any information on the topic, right? So we have talked a lot about peace, but oftentimes it's been from a moral perspective, it's been from an ethical perspective. We've had our own definitions of peace, and we really wanted to kind of sort of provide that additional sort of quantitative lens to see what perhaps very intuitive results or perhaps very surprising results come out of that. With the objective is essentially to, number one, understand what the most peaceful countries on Earth have in common. And the idea is the more we understand about that, the more we can actually sort of apply these things or implement those things in our own countries or in the countries in which we're working. So, you know, leading into the second part of the question, I definitely think that the positive peace element is perhaps kind of sort of the main takeaway here. You know, we're always finding ways of being able to improve our research by incorporating new indicators, new data. But fundamentally, a lot of it comes down not to what is the actual snapshot of peacefulness right now or how is any individual country doing, but more about what are the underlying attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peace. Now, a lot of you that are working in development are already tackling many of those factors, right? Elements related to education, to healthcare, to human rights, to governance, to corruption, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you look into our positive peace research in detail, you can actually see a lot of system dynamics at play. So we definitely think that there's an opportunity to be able, in the fields, to be able to sort of use systems thinking a lot more comprehensively to be able to tackle or to be able to sort of build, if you will, these underlying characteristics of strength.
Great, thank you so much. So we have multiple questions coming in. We have more of a statement, but also if you have any thoughts on this, Clem McCartney wrote, Michael, you referred to the uptick in militarization over the last few years as a response to increased geopolitical tensions, but the causality may work in the opposite direction. Increase in militarization may have ramped up global geopolitical tensions. So Michael says, I'm sure you can think of leaders who might have encouraged that trend. What are your thoughts? Have you seen that happening?
Yeah, so that is entirely plausible, Clem, and it's very difficult, and that happens with a lot of these indicators, not only the militarization, and it's very difficult to be able to kind of sort of unpack these, and this is why oftentimes we talk about correlation rather than causation, because not only do a lot of these things happen in parallel, but it's really impossible to split them between, especially when you get into elements related to positive peace, right? You could say that militarization leads to increased global tensions, but then those increased global tensions lead to militarization, right? It's kind of sort of, it's a complex but also a very simple dynamic. There's a couple of things that I'd say about militarization specifically, perhaps just to complement my previous comments, and that is that some of the stuff that we've seen in militarization, specifically military expenditure over the last year, is also in part due to COVID, and that is actually more in the numbers than anything else. For example, military investment has been sort of allocated in previous years, but has been maintained, but the economy has significantly shrank. So that means that overall, as a percentage of GDP, military expenditure seems to have increased. However, even taking that into account, we still see this reversal in trend as well, and it actually builds on a trend that we'd started to see in the previous year. So, Clem, I'm sorry, I don't really have an answer for you. I definitely think that it's plausible and entirely likely that it is a combination of both of those factors feeding into each other.
Sure, and just to get to a bit of another question by Kay Abbott that deals with militarization. Abbott's asking, why do you believe, or your organization, why would increased militarization necessarily mean decreased peace? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. And this is a conversation. This is a question that we actually get a lot when we speak in kind of sort of security settings. For example, we actually have a GPI presentation coming up with NATO Canada on Friday. And you know, the fundamental premise is, well, hold on a minute. I mean, militaries keep us safe, right? In fact, they stop the world from becoming more violent. I mean, that's debatable, of course, you know, because you could also say that militaries in a number of cases have been abusers of human rights or are used essentially in wars, and the outcome of that is death around the world. But really, IEP tries not to get into that debate at all, both in terms of militarization and police forces, for example. It is clear that there are always going to be bad people around the world. There's potentially always a need for a military, in the sense that I think it's very difficult for us to envisage, at least right now, any country that is completely peaceful, or a world that is completely peaceful in which jails and militaries are not needed. But having that as a starting definition is a valuable starting point. So the way that we look at militarization is we look at it as being an element or a symptom of the fear of violence, right? You either have a military because you are fearful of an occupation, or you're fearful of another country who could potentially invade you, or on the contrary of that, you have expansionistic or imperialistic tendencies and would like to use your military to be able to conquer other lands. Either way, we see it as a symptom of a fear of violence. Once again, we're not placing any moral judgment or giving any advice as to what is kind of sort of the optimal amount of military around the world, because that shifts completely depending on the context. But we are saying nonetheless that it is a symptom of the fear of violence. Let me just give you one more example related to police forces. Let's say, for example, that you have two countries, Finland and Mexico, and you have a police rate of, I don't know, 400 per 100,000, 400 police officers per 100,000 people, right? In the case of Mexico, people would be fearful because they would think that there aren't enough police on the streets. In the case of Finland, people would be fearful because they sense that there are too many police on the streets. So as you can see, all of these dynamics are kind of sort of very complex. We choose not to get into the debate, rather present the information and for people to take the conclusions that they will.
Great, thank you so much. We have a raised hand from, and excuse me for any mispronunciation, Niandu, and if you want to correct me when I unmute you, please feel more than free to. I'm going to unmute you if you would like to ask your question yourself. Oh, it says that you're self-muted, so I'm going to keep trying to unmute you. If you would like to unmute yourself, that would be great, but I will keep trying to do that over the next few minutes, and in the meantime, I will ask a question sort of relating to this. Do you find, and this is from Christina Beering, and again, sorry for any mispronunciation, do you find, Michael, that are democratic countries generally more peaceful, i.e., is there a strong link between democracy and peace?
So the short answer is yes. That is something that we find. I mean, if you look at the top 10 peaceful countries, they are liberal democracies. The bottom least peaceful countries are generally authoritarian regimes, and you can see that throughout the index and throughout the spectrum as well, right? You can see a progressive increase in authoritarianism as you move down the index. Now, granted that there are some indicators that are actually sort of directly tied to that, for example, the political terror scale, but you could also argue technically that you could have an authoritarian regime that doesn't have that. That just tends to be sort of a tendency of authoritarian regime. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. Interestingly, though, in terms of perceptions of risk, the actual fear of violence, at least in the initial survey that we looked at just then, which I should actually have noted during them, was slightly before COVID. So there's a new survey being done right now that will actually sort of report on any changes that there may have been since COVID. Does actually report feelings of safety increase in authoritarian regimes. So that's just an interesting distinction there.
Great, thank you. And we have gotten Niandu.
Jennifer, if it's okay, let me just continue on that point. I'd like to bring in positive peace.
Sure.
You know, countries with high levels of positive peace are more democratic in nature in the same way. I mean, ultimately, the ones that tend to be at the top of the global peace index over time are also the ones that with high levels of positive peace for the reasons that I described before. You know, one of the reasons that democracies tend to be more peaceful is because they also tend to be more resilient. They have many more ways in which to be able to deal with any particular crisis, whether that be COVID-19, whether it be a political shock or a natural disaster. They simply have many more different ways. There is a sounder business environment. There's a more, a higher free flow of information, right? There's the acceptance of the rights of others, high levels of representation, a stronger government. All of these different kind of sort of elements combine in liberal democracies to make them more resilient and therefore less likely to degenerate into conflict.
Great, thank you so much. And now we have Niandu with DIFA, who does DM&E from West Africa in Niger. Would you like to ask your question?
Okay,
You're unmuted now.
thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, great, thank you.
Okay, my question is just about I have seen that we have in the presentation, Michael talked about Burkina Faso, but I didn't see comments about Niger or about Mali, Sahel, that we know that during this time we have a lot of attacks and also terrorism attacks in these countries. I don't know. I would like to know why or why this happened.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, thank you. So the short answer is yes, you're absolutely right. We have seen, for example, deterioration in peacefulness regionally throughout the Sahel region and sub-Saharan Africa, kind of sort of as a main region there. As well as the Global Peace Index, we produced the Global Terrorism Index, which comes out at the tail end of the year. So the last one we produced was in November 2020, last year, and that actually spent a lot of time talking about increases in levels of terrorism in that region, specifically the transfer of kind of sort of many ISIS capabilities from the Middle East region to that region as well, both in terms of formal structures and kind of sort of ISIS affiliations as well. So the short answer is we have seen a significant deterioration in peacefulness in that region. A large part of it is due to an increase in terrorism and obviously the impact on political instability that has. So I think, a lot of the characteristics that we are seeing in Burkina Faso, which is currently 134th in the index, we are seeing in other countries, whether that be Mali, whether that be Niger, etc.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna shift gears and thank you again for asking your question. I know it's not always the easiest to unmute yourself and ask directly, so we really, really appreciate that. I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and I have a couple questions that have come in that have to do with the populations that you surveyed. So the first question is about indigenous populations and traditions. It's from Gregory Simpkins. Gregory asks, how do indigenous traditions impact how peace building operates? Have you found any information in your surveys to do with this topic?
Sure. So just to clarify, we don't actually do these surveys ourselves. These surveys are conducted by Gallup as part of their world poll. The questions in particular are issued by Lloyd's Register, who's doing this broader analysis of world risk, and we've been asked to analyze a subset of those questions. So if you look at sort of the methodology of Gallup, they do take a number of different measures to be representative of the overall population. So that would include not only indigenous groups, but all kind of sort of different demographic kind of sort of divisions within any individual country. In terms of kind of sort of the impact of indigenous traditions on peace building, or the correlations or the involvement there, I don't think that we have a whole lot of detailed analysis. I can definitely kind of sort of talk perhaps kind of sort of more on an opinion base. I mean, I think that there's a tremendous amount of things that we can continue and should continue to learn from indigenous communities. We recently, for example, one of our positive peace activators recently kind of sort of conducted sort of a detailed analysis and a series of workshops and kind of sort of exchange events with the Niska Nation in Canada. And we really saw significant overlaps between the 8 pillars of positive peace and indigenous traditions. So, you know, I think that there are lots of these underlying elements, these elements that create and sustain peacefulness over time, that are really kind of sort of reflected in indigenous culture, and we should and could learn from a lot more.
Great, thank you. And how do you, this is from Leslie Solis, and I am aware of our time, but I'm going to go over a little bit, and feel free to stay if you can, and if you can't, that is understandable. But Leslie Solis asks, how do you incorporate differences in the experience of different populations, or how have those who are conducting the surveys for you, for example, populations in vulnerable situations, is there something, and is this something you would like to explore further in the future?
So the short answer is that Gallup does have in place a number of kind of sort of elements that you know, attempt to ensure that accurate representation. I'm not across all of them, but they are a very well-respected institution. I know, for example, that they have in their Gallup World Poll, they have a set of sort of core questions that don't change depending on the country, and then additional questions that are added depending on a particular context, and particularly to be able to account for socioeconomic differences, just to name a few. So those, and I apologize, Leslie, there was a second part of the question there. Jennifer, could you repeat it?
If you would, in the future,
Right.
if this isn't something that is being done in great depth now, is that something you'd be more interested in looking into?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we've entered a multi-year partnership with Lloyd's to study this more in detail. I mean, you know, we were only really able to sort of put this in the Global Peace Index. We received we've only just received this past data. We want to continue this analysis. Of course, it's going to be very interesting to explore what happens, or what has happened to these global perceptions since COVID-19. And of course, we want to do the more basic analysis of sort of comparing these perceptions to actual levels of peacefulness according to the Global Peace Index. So we foresee us doing significantly more research in this area in the coming year.
Great, thank you. And to wrap things up, I'm just, I have kind of probably a double question if I'm being completely honest, but it's again from Christina, and I have a bit of a comment, and if you want to have any, from Robert Humphreys, if you want to have any comment on Robert's comment. But first from Christina, generally, if you could give us a quick overview of who uses your research, and if you have any example of how it has potentially impacted policies and government decision making. And then Robert, which it's a bit connected, a bit not, but Robert just made the comment that national and regional governments may create their own peace indexes, so to compare their own political subdivisions. So do you have any interaction with that, or work with them in that way, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
But if you want to look at the first part, which is who uses your research, do you have examples of impact on policy making and government decision making?
Yes, I'm going to try and answer all of those questions in one, perhaps starting from the back. So in terms of kind of sort of the subnational analysis, both in terms of a negative peace, right, the Global Peace Index, the superficial measure of peace, and then positive peace, there's the more underlying analysis. We have, for example, done that in a number of countries, including the United States. We've just launched the Mexico Peace Index, and what that does is it looks at peacefulness at the level of the 32 states within Mexico. And so it tracks trends in peacefulness over time. And this is the first year that we've actually done sort of a positive peace subnational analysis as part of the Mexico Peace Index as well. We've done consultancy research for the government of Zimbabwe, for example, in which we've looked to positive peace indicators specifically related to industry. And then, you know, in terms of the Global Peace Index, I mentioned before, thankfully, it is something that is used extensively by people like the World Bank, by the United Nations, by USAID. Almost, not disappointingly, but almost to the point in which well, let me restate that. One of my strategic objectives is to work with these organizations currently to be able to increase their understanding and their use of the positive peace index, because the Global Peace Index provides us with a snapshot of peacefulness around the world. It tells us about trends, but it really doesn't tell us much about what are the potential solutions and what we should be working on as a humanity, as a multilateral institution, or as a country. Positive peace, on the other hand, provides us that sort of deeper understanding of the attitudes, institutions that create and sustain peace, right? Which is essentially what a lot of policy work should be about. So we have been working with the government of Philippines, who has kind of sort of adopted positive peace as one of their sort of local peace building frameworks. We've had significant successes with that in dealing with counterinsurgency in Mindanao. The city of Culiacan, which is the headquarters or the homeland of the El Chapo and the Sinaloa cartel, have adopted positive peace as a way of being able to sort of look, broadly speaking, from kind of sort of a 20,000 foot view of all of the different socially sort of focused initiatives that they have underway to make sure that they're sort of touching and tackling and all of the elements related to the construction of positive peace as well. And just to share one more example, we're currently in discussions with the Colombian community of Algeciras, who's applying to be a collective victim of the conflict. And what they would like to do is they would like to tailor a reparations plan or a development plan for the community based on the 8 pillars of positive peace. So those are just some examples of where research is being used and where we hope it can be used more in the future.
Great, thank you so much. That's pretty much every question. I do have one more in if you're feeling up to it, but no pressure. I can send it to you in email.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, sure. So our last question before we wrap up is from Paul Heiderbrecht, and again, apologies for my pronunciation. How useful do you think SDG 16 is when it comes to focusing global efforts around addressing negative peace and building positive peace?
So, I mean, I think obviously it's very useful because it really kind of sort of brings the focus towards kind of sort of peace as being a central tenet. I mentioned kind of sort of before that peace, like the availability of water, is one of these kind of sort of central pillars of us being capable of tackling future global challenges. An ongoing challenge perhaps of the SDGs more broadly, and we reported on this a couple of years back, and the report is available on our webpage also, is that even though the targets are actually, the 169 targets are actually quite concrete, there are very, very few countries that actually collect that data. So the SDG framework is great in terms of providing us a general direction, but it's actually quite bad, and perhaps you've seen this through your work as well, at actually being able to measure how much of an impact we're having over time, because there are so very few countries that actually track these metrics. And certainly if you want to sort of put them all in a bucket and then compare them, it's practically impossible. On the good side, what we do see is we do see significant correlation between the SDGs and, say, our positive peace research. For example, 85% of these 169 targets actually touch on at least 1 or 2 pillars of positive peace. Things that the SDGs don't necessarily touch on that we think are important are this free flow of information, which we see as a key pillar of positive peace, and also a relatively little mention of low levels of corruption as well overall.
All right, thank you so much for that, and thank you everyone for staying with us today, and thank you for your very comprehensive and engaging presentation. Michael, we've had multiple people ask if they can get the slides, so I will be talking to you about that and seeing what I can get out to people after this presentation. And just to remind everyone that the recording will be going up on DME for Peace over the next day. It should be up by tomorrow. That is the plan, and maybe even by end of today. But I want to say a special thank you to our host, Michael Collins of IEP, and to everyone who could join us today, everyone who asked questions, raised their hand, or just listened in. Thank you for showing up and letting us keep doing this and having these great conversations. And just a reminder that I shared links to not only the report, but to the rest of IEP's work in the chat box that you can access now. You'll even be able to see the peace index that was referenced to do specifically with Mexico and previous GPIs and everything like that. So please, if you are interested, which it seems like everyone is, check out those links and check out the recording on DME for Peace once it is up. And That is it for us today. We will be back in July with another M&E Thursday talk. I cannot believe that it is July already, but here it is. The registration page for that talk will go up on DME for Peace in the usual place under the Thursday talk tab in the navigation menu. That will go up at the start of July, and we will also circulate emails to promote it. So be on the lookout for that through email and social media. And also, I will be sharing some contact information with Michael and IEP. So if you want to continue those conversations and hear more about their future work and what they're up to, you can email me or they will reach out to you. And thank you so much for everything today. And that's it from me. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day, evening, or mornings.